Even email he sent me last night. This was as the game was getting out of hand. And by the way, Smokey, this is the type of game that will happen in the second round of a 12-team playoff. Yep, give 4 teams a bye. This is what will happen. We don't know that, but there's a good chance there's going to be blowouts. But yet again, as we've said before, when there were 4, there have been blowouts more often than not leading up until this year with the 2 classic semifinal games.
Yeah, I think there's maybe a couple of teams, I don't know, maybe on any given night, a handful of teams that could have at least kept that more respectable than TCU did. Maybe TCU on another night, although I find that doubtful after watching what we watched. I think that was probably going to be similar results regardless of whenever you played that game. But I don't know, I saw it from a couple of different angles as far as the expanded playoff. I mean, on the one hand, I think you can make a great argument for why the BCS should come back, just as far as like having the top 2 and just keeping it as far as the top 2 goes. But I don't know. I think the last night was just a sign that the expanded playoff is probably the better idea. I mean, in terms of just having some more even-handed matchups, you'll get those in the first round. And in the second round, yeah, it's probably going to get dicey when a Georgia with extra rest has to take on whoever won the Texas Tech game or whatever. Yeah, but what scenario is Georgia not whooping somebody and other than playing Alabama or other than playing, what flavor of the month team that you want to put up there?
Or Ohio State.
So, so Ohio State, Alabama. So, basically the same schools we talk about over and over and over again. Outside of those schools, like would Michigan have played them better? Maybe, probably. I have no idea on that front, but, I don't think that last night convinced me the 4-team playoff is the way to go. I think it left me thinking that, hey, TCU, that's great. They got a playoff win in the future. There will be more teams that have that opportunity to do so. But ultimately, it doesn't matter if you have 2 or 4 or 8 or 12 or whatever. The Georgias of the world are going to rise to the top and win this bad boy more often than they aren't. And, there's probably, given the attrition that's going to be needed at this next level, like TCU's, like Georgia's third stringers were more talented than some of TCU's starters. I mean, ultimately.
Well, and based on the recruiting rankings, again, that isn't always
that's what they're supposed to be. But like, right, they're supposed to be. So, like, how's a team going to fare playing 3 weeks into a playoff against the Georgia team? Yeah. I mean, who's going to be able to deal with that depth-wise? Close to nobody, except for, again, the same schools that we were just mentioning. So, I don't know how much that really shakes my belief in the expanded playoff watching last night. It does tell me, though, that, you could have done things differently and maybe there would have been a different result. But ultimately, I think the Dogs and of course, Ohio State fans are going to have their reasons for believing the way they believe because they had them on the ropes. I mean, they had that very team that we watched dominate last night as close as you can be to not even being in that game. So Ohio State, Alabama, maybe your OUs and your Texases, in the future with the SEC backing behind them are on that level as well. But I don't know how many others are, quite frankly. And so for the TCUs and teams like that, it's going to be a very interesting next step in the process. The good news is that they will have more accessibility. It's just, can they ever stack enough playoff wins and other titles to be able to reel in the kind of depth that you're seeing at only a select few places. And I don't know. Does this drive more parity, or does it create the same thing that we've seen, which is basically the same schools winning it year after year after year? I'm not sure yet, but I'm certainly not anti-expansion after last night.
If I remember, LSU smacked Clemson. It wasn't 65-7. It was 42-25. Alabama's had theirs when they've rolled to a game or two. We'll figure it out. Let's see what happens. And maybe the fact that there's expansion, maybe some of those that otherwise won't compete will get better. And who knows with NIL and transfer portal. But it will be a surprise if the next 3 to 5 years the national champions aren't Alabama or Georgia. Maybe, again, an LSU, an upcoming Florida State, Ohio State, whoever it might be, and then everyone else along the way. The 2019 LSU, again, was on another level. Joe Burrow and LSU got red hot. Dave Aranda, defensive coordinator on that team. Phil Venzer, when will we see those 4-star players start transferring to G5 schools? Or some of those 4-star players transfer to other Power 5 schools, which is what we've seen. Ron Lowney, the Big 12 needs to promote their basketball teams instead. Okay, Ron.
Well, they have a better shot at winning the title than that, as they've played for it a bunch of times here recently and won it on a couple of occasions here, most recently with Baylor and Kansas. But yeah, I mean, that's where they do have an advantage if there is an advantage. But on the football side of things, like that gulf that you feel like is always sort of been there and is only grown probably through the OU, Texas, USC, UCLA moves, and then all the other rumored possibilities that came after that. Yeah, there is a gulf, but I think we all knew that. I don't know. Does last night more shake your faith in there being more TCUs, or does it make you think like, no, the more games and therefore having some more even matchups than Georgia TCU in the final is going to be better? I think it probably depends on who you ask. I'm a little bit in the middle because I don't know that a TCU in the modern era moving forward is ever going to find themselves in the championship game again. Having to win like 3 games to get there, and maybe only 2 if you get a bye. I guess if that's the way that it's set up, but I don't know. So is it better or worse in that regard? I'm not sure.
I know that I don't mind dynasties. I've always kind of almost appreciated them, and Georgia's now won a couple in a row. Last time it was 10 years ago with Alabama. But really, everyone acts like dynasties or a group of 3 to 5 teams running college football is some kind of a new thing. I think it also goes with the fact that maybe the gap is getting bigger, which we've heard. But in the 60s, it was pretty much the same. You had the Texas and South Carolina and Southern Cal. You had Notre Dame. In the 70s, you had USC and Notre Dame and Alabama and again, Oklahoma. In the 80s, you had Penn State. You had a couple win national titles. Then the Miami run started. In the 90s, you had Florida State. You had Nebraska. They made their run. And then, of course, the USC, Ohio State, Florida, LSU run. There's always been kind of a gap. It's not. The one thing about college football is there usually are the same teams that regurgitate, in a way, the national titles. Obviously, the SEC's been incredibly successful, really, since they won their first title back, Florida in 2006 that won the national title. But it doesn't mean they didn't have teams in the past that weren't dominant. Most of the time, it was Alabama, and earlier than that, LSU a part of that conversation. I get this feeling that everyone thinks that college football's always had 15 or 20 teams that compete for the national title, and it's actually been even less than in maybe college basketball. College basketball, Cinderella can live. In college football, it's always been teams that cycle, that run the league or run the sport for maybe 8 to 10 years at a time.
Yeah, it has been. But you've seen different teams pop up and get close enough to be able to taste it and smell it, feeling like they've got, just a little bit more to go to be able to get there. And I don't know that, like a TCU, for example, they can go beat a Michigan and then therefore be in this title game. Before in the BCS, hey, finish top 2. And there was certainly controversy with that. But now you're going to be asking a lot more of every team to be able to make it to the national championship
They don't have
game.
to just win Michigan. No, they have to win Michigan,
you have to beat
Michigan. Yeah.
After you beat Tennessee and then go beat Georgia Tech and then go play Alabama in the national title game.
Yep.
After you've done your whole regular season spiel and the conference title game and all of that, like you're asking TCU to basically go do what they did, and we know how close they were to not having done that. We know how close they were to having like 3 or 4 losses in the regular season. Texas Tech was certainly possible. Baylor was certainly possible. There's a couple of others. But they to their credit, got unscathed. But, yeah, you're asking them to basically do what they did all the way up until last night, but then win probably a couple more games or at least one more game against a team in the same vicinity as a Michigan, do that, and then go and finally play Georgia. And I just don't know, depth-wise, Georgia's got better ranked players on their third string than most teams have on their entire roster. They're built for being able to take care of business like that, and Alabama's built that way. Is anybody going to be able to be built enough to even challenge that? Probably not, but then again, to your point, like, is that any different really than what we've seen? So maybe last night in TCU's like the last gasp of air for the dreamers out there that somebody who's not a quote-unquote blue blood can make it, but also that might have been the door shutting on that ever happening again in some ways, because the mountain that the teams like that are going to have to climb in comparison to the teams who are actually built and suited up to do that is, it's a reason to ask the question.
The men's basketball tournament ends up usually with blue bloods who win it and get to the Final Four, but it's the first weekend when Cinderella lives and puts on the slipper that really has created how dramatic that particular tournament is, because in the end, usually the teams you think will win it do, with an occasional maybe bump in the road or surprise along the way. We have Mac Rhodes coming up next.
Yeah, and TCU, and to that point, now all of a sudden you will have, let's say, Oregon and Tennessee, whatever, they win their first-round playoff games as opposed to whatever bowl they would be in otherwise, and they get the opportunity. That's why I asked beforehand, would you rather have the opportunity or just end on a high note? And that's kind of where that question on Twitter came from. But, yeah, you're going to be able to celebrate a first-round and maybe a second-round playoff win. You probably won't be able to celebrate a national title very often, but those playoff wins do stack up kind of like bowl championships do, and that is something that you can continue building your resume, but to reach the actual mountaintop, that's still for a select few.